September 12, 1943, 16:25 hours. German defensive position, Salerno beachhead, Italy. Gefreiter Franz Weidel had fought through Poland, France, and 2 years on the Eastern Front before his regiment was transferred to Italy in summer 1943. He understood infantry combat, the chaos, the fear, the way soldiers behaved under fire. Russian attacks had been ferocious, but often poorly coordinated. French resistance had been brave, but inconsistent. The Eastern Front had taught him that courage alone wasn't sufficient without discipline, that attackers needed both determination and organization to overcome prepared defenses. His company occupied positions on high ground, overlooking the Salerno beachhead, where Allied forces had landed 3 days earlier. German defensive planning assumed that holding the high ground would allow defenders to inflict casualties that would stall the invasion before it could consolidate. The terrain favored defenders completely. Open approaches under direct observation, prepared fighting positions, interlocking fields of fire. Standard defensive doctrine said attackers would need overwhelming superiority to advance up those slopes against experienced defenders. Through the afternoon rain, Weidel observed British forces preparing for an assault. He expected the usual pattern: artillery preparation, then infantry advancing in rushes using available cover, with predictable pauses when defensive fire became too intense. The Russian approach had been to mass infantry and accept horrific casualties to achieve breakthrough. The British typically relied more on firepower and careful coordination, advancing methodically rather than charging recklessly. What he saw instead was formation that made no sense tactically. British infantry emerged from their assembly areas and began advancing up the slope in extended line formation, not rushing from cover to cover, but walking steadily uphill in near-perfect alignment. The soldiers wore dark uniforms with distinctive collar flashes that Weidel's optics couldn't identify clearly at this distance. Their rifles were held at the ready position, their spacing maintained precise intervals, and their pace was measured and unhurried despite the defensive fire beginning to fall among them. Weidel's section commander recognized the formation and spoke with tone that conveyed information beyond mere identification. Coldstream Guards. The words carried weight that Weidel didn't immediately understand. Then his section began firing, pouring machine gun and rifle fire into the advancing line. The British soldiers continued walking uphill. Some fell. Weidel saw men go down as rounds found targets, but the formation didn't break or seek cover. The survivors simply closed the gaps and maintained their advance. At perhaps 150 meters distance, the Guards halted, took firing positions without apparent disorder, and began returning fire with volume and accuracy that suggested professional training. Then they rose and continued advancing. The pattern repeated twice more: advance, halt, and fire, advance again, each iteration bringing them closer despite the casualties they were clearly taking. The mechanical precision of the movement was unlike anything Weidel had encountered. These soldiers were advancing into machine gun fire with the discipline of parade ground drill. At 50 meters, the Guards fixed bayonets while still moving forward. Weidel's section was taking casualties now. The British return fire was devastatingly accurate. At 30 meters, the Guards increased their pace to a run while maintaining formation cohesion. The subsequent close-quarters fighting lasted perhaps 10 minutes and was extraordinarily violent. When it ended, Weidel's section had been overrun, and he was falling back with survivors toward the next defensive line. His section commander gathered the survivors and reported to the company commander. "We engaged Coldstream Guards, conducting assault on our position. Defensive fires inflicted casualties, but failed to break their formation or stop their advance. They closed to bayonet range and cleared our position through hand-to-hand combat. Request identification of Coldstream positions before further defensive operations. The report's phrasing revealed important information. This wasn't enemy unit encountered randomly, but specific regiment that warranted tactical consideration. The regiment that carried 3 centuries. The Coldstream Guards traced lineage to 1650, making them one of the oldest continuously serving regiments in the British Army. This wasn't merely historical trivia, but foundation for everything about how the regiment operated and how its soldiers understood their role. 3 centuries of military tradition created institutional identity that shaped behavior under fire in ways that training alone couldn't replicate. The regimental culture emphasized specific values that distinguished Guards regiments from conventional infantry. Discipline was paramount, not merely following orders, but maintaining perfect military bearing under all circumstances. Courage was expected as basic requirement rather than exceptional virtue. Professional competence was standard that every soldier had to meet, regardless of background or experience. Unit cohesion was more than camaraderie. It was deeply ingrained belief that the regiment's reputation depended on every soldier's performance. The selection and training process ensured that these values were internalized before soldiers joined operational units. Guards regiments didn't accept conscripts directly into their ranks. Instead, they recruited from volunteers who'd already completed basic training and demonstrated military aptitude. The subsequent Guards training emphasized drill, weapons handling, and tactical procedures executed with precision that exceeded standard infantry requirements. The training wasn't merely teaching skills, it was instilling mindset where perfection was minimum acceptable standard. The visible distinction of Guards regiments included uniform details that communicated elite status. The Coldstream Guards wore distinctive red collar flashes and bearskin caps on ceremonial occasions. These weren't just decorative elements, but symbols of regimental identity that soldiers wore with pride that bordered on arrogance. German forces learned to recognize these visual markers and understood that encountering Guards regiments meant facing enemy who would fight with determination and skill that exceeded normal expectations. British military leadership employed Guards regiments for missions where success was critical and where conventional infantry might prove inadequate. The Guards were assigned to assault positions that other units had failed to take, to hold defensive lines that couldn't be allowed to break, to conduct operations where failure would compromise broader strategic objectives. This employment pattern reinforced the Guards' self-perception as elite forces and validated German perception that Guards' presence indicated significant British commitment to specific operations. North Africa, where the reputation was forged. The Coldstream Guards' North African service during 1942-43 provided conditions where their combat characteristics proved decisive. The campaign featured mobile warfare that required infantry to operate independently of heavy support, defend positions against armor-heavy German attacks, and conduct assaults against prepared defenses. The Guards demonstrated effectiveness across all these requirements, establishing reputation among German forces that would persist throughout the war. The fighting in Tunisia during the final Axis collapse in North Africa saw Coldstream Guards battalions conducting operations against experienced German forces who were defending desperately to avoid complete destruction. The Guards assaulted German positions in mountainous terrain where attackers had to advance under observation across open ground. Standard British infantry tactics emphasized artillery support and careful coordination, but the terrain and tactical situation often prevented textbook approaches. The Guards adapted, conducting attacks with minimal fire support when necessary and achieving objectives through disciplined execution rather than overwhelming firepower. One engagement at Jebel Bu Aukaz in late April 1943 exemplified Guards' combat effectiveness. German forces held ridge positions that controlled the approach to Tunis. British command assigned the Coldstream Guards to seize these positions as part of the final offensive. The assault required advancing up steep slopes under direct fire from prepared German positions. Artillery support was limited because the terrain made observation difficult, and German positions were too close to advancing infantry for safe fire missions. The Guards conducted the assault through methodical fire and movement, companies advancing alternately while others provided covering fire. German defenders reported being impressed by the coordination, despite the difficult terrain and heavy defensive fire. The Guards reached German positions and cleared them through close combat that German survivors described as more aggressive than they'd encountered from British forces previously. The ridge fell within hours, rather than the days that German commanders had assumed would be required. German after-action reports from Tunisia specifically noted Guards' effectiveness. One report stated, "British Guards regiments demonstrate combat capabilities exceeding normal British infantry. These units maintain tactical cohesion under fire, execute coordinated maneuvers despite casualties, and demonstrate determination in close combat that matches or exceeds German standards." Forces engaging Guards units should anticipate that defensive operations will require maximum effort and that Guards attacks will continue despite casualties that would cause other British units to withdraw. Italy, the campaign that defined Guards' legend. The Italian campaign from 1943 through 1945 provided continuous combat that tested Guards regiments under conditions ranging from amphibious assaults to mountain warfare to urban combat. The Coldstream Guards participated in virtually every major operation, conducting missions that ranged from spearhead assaults to defensive stands that held against overwhelming German counterattacks. The cumulative experience established Guards' reputation as the most reliable British infantry available for critical operations. The Salerno landings in September 1943 required Guards battalions to assault defended beaches and then hold beachheads against German counterattacks designed to drive Allied forces back into the sea. The Guards went ashore in initial assault waves, clearing German defensive positions through close combat that German defenders described as more aggressive than they'd anticipated from British forces. When German forces launched major counterattacks several days after the landing, Guards units held positions that were critical to preventing German breakthrough to the beaches. The fighting around Monte Cassino during winter and spring 1944 saw Guards regiments conducting operations in conditions that tested physical and mental endurance beyond what training could prepare soldiers for. The terrain was mountainous and covered with prepared German defensive positions. Weather was cold and wet. Supply was difficult. Casualties were high, and replacements often lacked the training standard that Guards regiments demanded. Yet the Guards maintained operational effectiveness, conducting attacks and holding defensive positions with reliability that British command counted on when planning operations. The Anzio beachhead operations in early 1944 placed Guards units in defensive positions that had to hold against repeated German attacks designed to eliminate the beachhead. The fighting was extraordinarily intense. German forces committed substantial resources to destroying what they correctly assessed as a strategic threat to their defensive lines. Guards battalions held positions through artillery bombardment and infantry assaults that lasted for weeks. German forces achieved penetrations at various points but consistently failed to break through where Guards units were positioned. One German intelligence summary from the Anzio period noted, British Guards units defending the beachhead demonstrate defensive capabilities that exceed normal infantry performance. These units maintain position, despite artillery preparation, and hold against infantry assault, even when positions are penetrated. Attacks against Guards-held positions require disproportionate resources relative to the tactical value of the objectives. Operational planning should avoid assigning Guards-defended positions as primary assault objectives when alternative approaches exist. The fighting at the Gothic Line in autumn 1944 required Guards regiments to assault German defensive positions in mountain terrain that favored defenders comprehensively. British command assigned Guards units to attack positions that previous assaults had failed to take, reflecting leadership confidence that Guards would succeed where others had failed. The Guards conducted coordinated attacks that combined infantry assault with armor support where terrain permitted, achieving penetrations through determination and tactical skill that validated the confidence British command placed in them. The discipline that Germans called inhuman. German accounts of combat against Guards regiments consistently emphasized the Guards' tactical discipline and how it differed from what German forces encountered fighting other British or Allied infantry. The difference wasn't merely degree of competence, but fundamental approach to combat that shaped how Guards units fought under conditions where less disciplined forces would break or become ineffective. The fire and movement coordination that Guards units demonstrated under fire impressed German observers who understood how difficult maintaining such coordination was when under attack. Standard infantry doctrine called for units to advance in bounds, with some elements providing covering fire while others moved. Executing this properly required soldiers to move on command while under fire, to maintain awareness of adjacent units' positions, to time movements precisely so that covering fire and movement were synchronized. Most infantry units struggled to execute this under combat stress. Guards units performed it routinely with precision that suggested extensive training and exceptional discipline. The formation integrity that Guards maintained during advances and withdrawals was particularly notable. German defensive doctrine relied on concentrated fire, breaking up attacking formations, which would then become easier to defeat in detail. Guards formations absorbed casualties, but didn't fragment. Soldiers closed gaps that casualties created and maintained cohesion that preserved tactical effectiveness. German machine gunners reported frustration that their fire would hit Guards soldiers but wouldn't break Guards formations, meaning that follow-up infantry assault had to contend with organized defenders rather than disorganized survivors. The close combat aggression that Guards demonstrated when assaults reached hand-to-hand range created tactical situations where German advantages in defensive firepower became irrelevant. Guards training emphasized bayonet combat and aggressive action in close quarters. German soldiers who'd survived close combat with Guards units described fighting that was more intense than they'd experienced against other British forces. The Guards' willingness to close to bayonet range deliberately, to advance into defensive positions rather than attempting to suppress them with firepower, created psychological pressure on defenders who recognized that close combat was imminent, regardless of how much fire they employed. The psychological steadiness that Guards demonstrated under artillery bombardment and air attack affected German tactical planning significantly. German doctrine relied on artillery preparation to degrade defending forces' effectiveness before infantry assault. Artillery fire that was sufficient to make other British units withdraw from positions often failed to dislodge Guards units who would remain in position and maintain combat effectiveness despite the bombardment. This forced German forces to commit infantry against positions they'd expected artillery would make untenable, which increased casualties and slowed operational tempo. Normandy, elite against elite. The Normandy campaign brought Guards units into sustained combat against German forces that included Wehrmacht's best remaining infantry and SS formations, whose fighting quality was comparable to Guards standards. The campaign tested whether Guards' combat effectiveness could prevail against opponents who matched them in training and motivation. The engagements demonstrated that Guards regiments could defeat even Germany's elite forces through combination of tactical skill and sustained determination. Operation Goodwood, in mid-July 1944, employed Guards Armored Division, which included Coldstream Guards infantry, in attempt to break through German defenses east of Caen. The operation required advancing across open terrain under observation from German positions on high ground. German forces defending this sector included SS Panzer formations whose combat effectiveness was proven through years of Eastern Front service. The tactical conditions favored defenders completely: clear fields of fire, prepared positions, and veteran troops who wouldn't break easily. The Guards advanced through defensive fire that destroyed numerous tanks and inflicted substantial casualties on accompanying infantry. What impressed German defenders was that Guards formations maintained cohesion despite the losses and continued executing tactical plans despite conditions that should have caused attacking forces to halt. German reports noted that Guards infantry continued dismounting from vehicles and assaulting positions even after their supporting armor had been destroyed, demonstrating determination that exceeded what German commanders had anticipated from British forces. The fighting around Canny village exemplified Guards' combat against German elite forces. SS Panzer Grenadiers held the village with support from Tigers and 88mm anti-tank guns positioned to cover all approaches. Guards infantry assaulted the village through coordinated attacks that employed armor support where possible and infantry assault where armor couldn't operate. The village fighting lasted for days and featured close-quarters combat that German survivors described as matching Eastern Front intensity. The Guards eventually took the village through persistent attacks that wore down German defenders despite the defenders' tactical advantages. German tactical assessments from Normandy fighting specifically noted Guards' effectiveness. One corps-level intelligence summary stated, "British Guards formations demonstrate combat capabilities comparable to our own elite units. Guards infantry maintains discipline under fire and executes coordinated attacks despite casualties. Guards units do not break when defensive positions are penetrated, but conduct immediate counterattacks to restore their lines. Tactical planning should treat Guards-held positions as equivalent to positions held by our own veteran formations in terms of defensive strength and expected duration of defense." The breakthrough into Germany. The final campaign into Germany in 1945 saw Guards regiments conducting operations against Wehrmacht forces who were defending their homeland with desperation that often exceeded their actual combat capability. The Guards participated in Rhine-crossing operations, breakthrough battles against fortified positions, and pursuit operations that required maintaining tempo despite German defensive efforts. The Guards' sustained performance throughout this period demonstrated that their effectiveness derived from institutional characteristics that weren't degraded by years of combat or by the approaching war's end. The Rhine crossing required Guards battalions to assault heavily defended river barriers under conditions where failure could compromise the entire operation. German forces understood that preventing Allied bridgeheads across the Rhine was strategically critical and defended crossing sites with all available forces. The Guards conducted assaults that achieved initial lodgements and then held them against German counterattacks until follow-on forces could exploit the crossings. The operations succeeded because Guards units executed complex river crossing procedures under fire with precision that required perfect coordination between infantry, engineers, and supporting arms. The advance beyond the Rhine featured numerous engagements where Guards units encountered German forces, making defensive stands in towns and villages. The urban combat required clearing buildings methodically while under fire from defenders who had prepared positions and knew the terrain. Guards units conducted these operations with effectiveness that maintained operational tempo. Towns that German forces expected to hold for days fell within hours because Guards' assault techniques overwhelmed defenders before they could organize sustained resistance. German prisoners captured during the final campaigns into Germany provided assessments that revealed continuing respect for Guards' combat effectiveness. One captured battalion commander stated, "When we learned that Guards regiments were in our sector, we knew our positions would be attacked aggressively and that our defenses would be tested thoroughly. Guards' attacks were persistent. They would conduct assault, be repulsed, reorganize, and attack again. Eventually, our defenses would be overwhelmed, not because Guards had superior numbers or firepower, but because they maintained offensive pressure that our forces couldn't sustain indefinitely."